There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in a house where everyone knows the truth, but no one is allowed to say it. Not the silence of empty rooms or sleeping children. Not the silence of winter mornings before the birds begin. This is something older and heavier. The kind of silence that presses down on the chest, that follows a person from room to room like a second shadow that outlasts the people who created it, and seeps into the walls themselves, into the wood and the plaster, into the portraits hanging in darkened hallways where no candle is ever lit. In 1847, on a working cotton plantation 12 miles southeast of Natchez, Mississippi, a woman named Nora was given an order that would quietly reshape the lives of every single person on that property for the next 2 decades. She was told to care for 2 children, to feed them, bathe them, sing to them, and keep them alive. She was told this not as a request. She was told this as a man tells a plow horse which field to work. What no one on that plantation fully understood, not the overseers, not the neighboring families who came to dine on Sundays, not the minister who blessed the house each Christmas, was the exact nature of what was being asked of her. They would not understand it for years. And when the understanding finally came, when the letters were opened, and the documents were laid bare on a courthouse table in the summer of 1866, the men who read them went quiet in a way that the witnesses in that room never forgot. One of them, a federal records clerk named Douglas Peel, wrote about it in a personal letter that survived among his family's papers. He described the moment as the slow collapse of something you had always believed was solid, like pressing your hand against a wall and finding it has no other side. This is the story of Nora, of a plantation called Grayfield, and of 2 children who were raised in a lie so carefully constructed that even they could not see it from the inside. This is the story of what Edmund Hale did and what it cost everyone around him. And this is the story of how the truth in the end does not stay buried no matter how many years of silence are poured on top of it. Stay with us. Edmund Hale arrived in Adams County, Mississippi in the spring of 1841 at 26 years old with a letter of introduction from his father's lawyer in Charleston, South Carolina, and enough capital to purchase land and begin a modest cotton operation. He was not by any account a man who inspired immediate trust. Neighbors who met him in those early years described him later in the depositions that would be collected 2 decades on, in curiously similar terms, composed, deliberate, never quite at ease. One woman, the wife of a neighboring planter, noted in a diary entry from 1842 that she found Edmund Hale to be a man who weighs his words before he speaks them and watches you while you hear them to know if they have landed where he intended. He was not cruel in the way that some men were cruel, loud, impulsive, theatrical in their brutality. He was something quieter and in certain ways more difficult to name. He made decisions the way a chess player makes decisions, with a calculation that preceded the move by a great deal of invisible thought and with a studied indifference to the suffering of whatever piece had been sacrificed. He purchased his land, 412 acres of rich alluvial soil between 2 creeks in March of 1841 from the estate of a deceased planter named Oakes, whose family had defaulted on debts accumulated over 2 reckless decades. Edmund paid less than the land was worth. He knew it, and the Oakes heirs knew it, but the terms had been set by the court, and there was nothing to be done. He renamed the property Grayfield, a name that suited it perfectly. Not gray in the sense of despair, but gray in the sense of a sky that has not yet decided whether to give sun or storm. He built the main house over the course of that first year and part of the second. A 2-story structure with a wide front gallery and 4 tall columns that announced the property's aspirations without quite fulfilling them. It was a planter's house in the mold of dozens of others in Adams County. Large enough to suggest prosperity, restrained enough to suggest caution. Edmund Hale never built anything for pleasure. He built things to be used. By 1843, Grayfield had 31 enslaved people working the cotton fields and the domestic operations of the house. Edmund had purchased most of them at auction in Natchez, that city which held in those years some of the most active slave markets in the entire South. A fact that its wealthier residents regarded with a mixture of civic pride and careful social distance. He was not wasteful in these purchases. He studied the listings the way he studied everything, methodically, without sentiment, looking for specific qualities that served his specific needs. Among those he purchased in 1843 was a woman named Nora. She was 22 years old at the time of purchase. She had been brought to Natchez from a tobacco plantation in Virginia, part of a larger lot sold when that operation went into bankruptcy. The auctioneer's notes, which would later become part of the documentary record, described her as healthy, of sound constitution, skilled in domestic labor, reported to read and write. That last detail was unusual enough that Edmund Hale underlined it in the listing. He paid significantly above the average price for her. What the listing did not describe, because such things were not listed, was the person inside the fact. The listing did not say that Nora had a memory like a trap, that she remembered faces, words, and the precise sequence of events with an accuracy that sometimes unsettled the people around her. It did not say that she was observant in the deep lateral way where that people become observant when their survival depends on reading a room before they enter it. It did not say that she had at the Virginia plantation quietly learned to read, not from anyone's permission, but from proximity, from watching the children of the house do their lessons while she worked near by, from borrowing books left on tables and returning them before they were missed. Edmund Hale did not know all of this when he purchased her, but he sensed enough of it to know she was the kind of person who was useful to keep close. She was assigned to the main house. In the fall of 1843, Edmund Hale married a woman named Clara Weston, the third daughter of a land-poor but well-regarded family from Port Gibson. Clara was 20 years old, small-framed, with dark eyes and a quiet manner that the county's social circuit occasionally mistook for shyness, but was in reality something more guarded. She had grown up in a house where money was discussed in worried tones behind closed doors, and she had learned, as such children do, to read the emotional weather of a room with considerable skill. She and Edmund were not, in the way that the word is typically used, a love match. The arrangement suited both families, and both parties understood this. Edmund needed a wife of respectable family to anchor his social position in Adams County society. Clara's family needed the financial security that marriage to a rising planter offered. These were not uncommon terms for the time and place. What was perhaps less common was the degree to which both Edmund and Clara understood those terms with the same clear eyes and never pretended otherwise. Clara moved into Grayfield in November of 1843. She and Nora met on the day of Clara's arrival. Clara had been brought from the carriage into the main hall, where the household staff had been assembled to receive her. She walked down the line of faces in the way that new mistresses did, briefly, assessingly with the particular performance of authority that the occasion required. She paused at Nora longer than at the others, not in hostility, in recognition of something she did not yet have words for. "You're Nora," Clara said. It was not a question. "Yes, Mom." Clara looked at her for a moment, then moved on. Later that evening, when the house had settled, and Edmund was in his study, Clara asked the housekeeper, an older enslaved woman named Ruth, about Nora. Ruth said she was skilled, quiet, and that Mr. Hale kept her on light indoor work. Clara noted this. She noted most things. The first 2 years of the marriage at Grayfield were, by outward measure, ordinary. Edmund managed his cotton operation with the same cold efficiency he applied to everything. The crops were adequate, not spectacular, but solid. He was building something deliberate and incremental, and he moved at the pace of someone who understands that patience is itself a form of power. Clara ran the household. She was, by the accounts of those who worked alongside her, a better manager than Edmund in the domestic sphere. More attentive to what needed doing, less prone to the dismissive impatience that characterized her husband's instruction style. She was not warm to the enslaved people of the household in the way that certain plantation mistresses performed warmth as a social virtue. She was instead consistent. She said what she expected. She did not change her expectations without reason, and she did not invent pretext for punishment. In the brutal moral arithmetic of the plantation system, this did not make her good, but it made her, in the daily experience of those around her, somewhat less unpredictable than most. Nora worked as Clara's personal attendant in those years. She helped with the household accounts, which Edmund had assigned to Clara and which Clara quietly shared with Nora. Because she was, as she once said to Ruth, the only one in this house besides me who can add. In the spring of 1845, Clara became pregnant for the first time. She lost the child at 4 months. In the fall of the same year, she became pregnant again. She lost that child at 6 months. The second loss was harder. Edmund received the news in his study and did not speak about it. The doctor, a man named Ambrose Vickers, who handled most of the county's medical business from his office in Natchez, told Clara that there was no medical reason necessarily for the losses, and that many women suffered them and went on to deliver healthy children. He said this with the practiced cheerfulness of a man who understood that his patient needed hope more than she needed precision, and Clara received it with the polite nodding of a woman who had heard words offered as comfort before and had learned to let them pass through without holding on. What changed in Clara after the second loss was not visible in her behavior. She continued to manage the household. She continued to appear at the Sunday dinners that the Hales hosted for the county's better families. She continued to speak to Edmund over meals with the civil measured exchange that passed for their version of domestic conversation. But something had altered in the texture of it, some slight hardening, as if a door she had kept slightly open had now been pulled to without being fully latched. Nora noticed she was the kind of person who noticed. In the spring of 1847, Clara Hale became pregnant for the 3rd time. By this point, the entire household understood without it needing to be said that the matter was fragile. Edmund, who ordinarily gave emotional events the consideration he gave changes in the weather, acknowledging them briefly before returning to more actionable matters, was observed by several people to be unusually attentive during this pregnancy. He reduced Clara's social obligations. He asked Dr. Vickers to make regular visits to the house. He made it known that he expected Clara to rest and that Nora was to attend to her personally and without interruption for other duties. Clara did not ask for this attention. She did not appear to want it, but she accepted the arrangements without comment in the way that she accepted most things Edmund decided. It was during this period, the late spring and early summer of 1847, that the thing happened, which would not be understood for many years, and which would, when it finally came to be understood, rewrite the history of everything that followed. The facts, as they were later reconstructed, are these. In March of 1847, before Clara's condition was widely known, a woman also came to be with child on the Grayfield plantation. She was 26 years old. Her name was Nora. There is no record of how this happened. That comes from Nora's own words. There is no account she gave that survived, if she gave one at all. What exists is documentary evidence assembled long after the fact that speaks in the indirect language of records. A ledger entry noting changes to her work assignment in April of 1847. A letter from Dr. Ambrose Vicers to Edmund Hale dated June 3, 1847, with a passage that was later read aloud in a courthouse and caused at least 2 men in attendance to stand up from their chairs, and the testimony of 2 enslaved women, a woman named Hattie and a woman named Lou, both of Grayfield, both interviewed by a Freedmen's Bureau agent in the fall of 1866 that established a sequence of events. No one who heard it could easily set aside. What the evidence indicates, and what the testimony of Hattie and Lou makes considerably more than a mere indication, is that Edmund Hale had, over the course of the winter of 1846 and the spring of 1847, made it known to Nora that she was required to submit to him. Hattie testified that Nora had confided this to her in fragments over weeks, in the way that people speak about things that have no safe language. Lou testified that she had herself witnessed Edmund Hale enter and leave the small room adjacent to the kitchen where Nora slept, on multiple occasions during the hours after the main house had gone dark. Neither woman testified to details beyond this. Neither was asked to. The bureau agent who conducted the interviews, a man named Patrick Corbin, whose notes still exist in the Mississippi Freedmen's Bureau records held in Washington, wrote in his summary that both women spoke with the calm precision of people recounting facts they have lived with for a long time and are relieved at last to be able to speak. The pregnancy that resulted was Nora's. The child, who was not one child but 2 twins delivered in late October of 1847, was hers by the biology of the thing, whatever else might be said about it. And it was Edmund Hale's by the same. What happened immediately after the delivery is the part of this story that is hardest to hold in the mind directly, because it requires understanding a logic that was not unusual in its time and place. However monstrous it appears from any other angle, Clara Hale had been delivered of a child 3 weeks before, Nora, her daughter, alive and healthy, the first child she had carried to term. The relief in the main house was considerable. Edmund received the news with what several people described as an unusual display of feeling. Not joy exactly, but something closer to the satisfaction of a man who has finally resolved a problem that has occupied him for some time. But Clara's delivery had been dangerous. Dr. Vickers had managed it through a difficult night, and the period that followed, the weeks of Clara's recovery, was marked by a frailty that alarmed the household. She was pale. She ate poorly. She did not feed the infant herself, as her body was not cooperating, and a wet nurse had been arranged from among the women on the property. When Nora delivered her twins 3 weeks later, alone in the dark with only Hattie beside her, the boy was delivered first, then the girl. By morning, the boy was gone from the room. Hattie's testimony about this moment is among the most precise passages in the entire Freedmen's Bureau record. She asked me where he was. I couldn't look at her. I said Mr. Hale had come in the night. She asked me what he had done. I told her he had taken the boy to the main house. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she asked if the girl was still there. I said yes. She held the girl against her, and she didn't speak again until the afternoon. By the following Sunday, it was publicly known in the main house that Clara Hale had delivered not one child, but 2, a girl, Josephine, born in early October, and a boy, Henry, whom she had delivered it was said, in a second labor 3 weeks later, which had been kept quiet for fear of the outcome. Dr. Vickers signed the documentation. Whether he believed what he signed, or whether he understood the transaction he was participating in, or whether he told himself a version of events that allowed him to complete the paperwork without examining it too closely. None of this is recorded. He died in 1859 before any of it came to light, and took whatever he knew with him. What the records say is this: Henry and Josephine Hale, twins, born to Edmund and Clara Hale, October 1847. Grayfield Plantation, Adams County, Mississippi. Clara Hale died of a fever in January of 1849, 15 months after the birth. She had spent those 15 months in an unusual relationship with the children. Those who observed her noted, with the casual observational cruelty of people who do not understand what they are seeing, that she seemed more attached to Josephine than to Henry, that she held Josephine more readily, nursed her more willingly in the early weeks, and that in the afternoons, when she was strong enough to sit in the gallery, she took Josephine onto her lap with something that looked from the outside like ordinary maternal preference. What was actually happening in Clara Hale's mind during those 15 months is of course not recoverable, but it is worth sitting with even for a moment before the story moves on. When Clara died in January of 1849, the children Henry and Josephine, now just over a year old, required care. Edmund Hale did not grieve publicly or for long. He received the condolences of the county in the correct manner, wore the correct colors for the correct period, and then returned to the business of Grayfield with the focused deficiency that had characterized everything else he did. He did not, in the period following Clara's death, appear to seek female company socially, not from sentiment necessarily, but from the practical understanding that a remarriage too soon would draw a certain kind of attention he preferred not to invite. The children needed care. On the morning of January 29, 1849, 9 days after Clara's death, Edmund Hale summoned Nora to his study. She came. He told her that she would now be responsible for the care of the children, Henry and Josephine. She would move from the servants' room to the upper floor of the main house, to the room beside the nursery. She would be with them during the day and available at night. She would manage their feeding, their clothing, their early learning. She would answer to him, and to no one else on matters pertaining to the children. What he said in that room, and what she said in return, was not witnessed. There is no record. What the record contains is what happened afterward. Nora moved to the upper floor. She came every morning to the nursery before dawn. She dressed them. She fed them. She carried them through the house and the galleries in the long afternoons, when the light turned the cotton fields a heavy gold. She sang to them in the evenings, songs that the children would remember in one form or another for the rest of their lives, without knowing why those particular melodies seemed to carry something in them that other songs did not. Josephine, the girl, had eyes the color of deep water. Henry the boy had a laugh that started silently and built slowly like something warming from the inside. They were different in almost every particular. She quiet and watchful, he easy and loud, and in this they perhaps resembled the mixed inheritance of the complicated thing they were, though no one at Grayfield named this resemblance, not even to themselves. Nora's daughter, her own girl, the twin who had not been taken, was named Pearl. She had been left with Nora after that October night, and she grew up in the quarters, cared for by Hattie and Lou, when Nora was in the main house, which was almost always. Pearl was not allowed in the main house. Edmund made no formal announcement of this rule. It was simply understood in the way that the rules of Grayfield were generally understood, not spoken, but as absolutely present as the walls of the building itself. Nora saw Pearl in the evenings when she was permitted to go to the quarters for the hours between supper and dark. She carried Pearl back to her own room when she could, which was rarely. She watched her daughter grow in the way that people watch things from a distance, able to see the shape, unable to touch it. She raised Edmund Hale's children. She raised her own blood. She could not say so. The years at Grayfield between 1849 and the beginning of the 1860s were, in the record that survives, years of strange and particular arrangement. Edmund Hale ran his plantation, expanded it modestly, and maintained the social and professional life of a prosperous county planter. He attended church. He entertained neighbors. He sat on the county agricultural committee. He was not in the circles that knew him. A notable man, not especially prominent, not especially remarkable. He was the kind of man who exists in the middle distances of history, present in the documents, but rarely at the center of anything. Henry and Josephine grew up. They were, by the accounts of those who encountered them, neighbors, the minister. The tutor Edmund eventually hired from New Orleans, considered unusual children in a way that people found difficult to articulate, but felt compelled to mention. They were described as perceptive, self-contained, older seeming than their years. The tutor, a Frenchman named Gaston Pearly, wrote to a colleague in 1856 that his two pupils at Grayfield were the most curious children I have taught, not in their academic performance, which is satisfactory, but in their manner, which is that of people who have learned to read the room before they enter it. He did not know he was describing in both of them the quality they had inherited from their mother. Henry was the more openly curious of the two. He asked questions constantly of the tutor, of the men who came to do business with Edmund, of the workers in the fields when he was old enough to walk out that far. Edmund regarded this quality with the mild, consistent impatience of a man who views questions as inefficiency unless they serve a useful purpose. Josephine watched more than she asked. She watched Nora. She had watched Nora for as long as she could remember, had watched her in the particular way that children watch the person who is most real to them, most present, most constant before they have any language for attachment or its absence. Nora had bathed her and fed her and held her when she was frightened of storms and sat beside her bed when she was sick. Nora had taught her the names of the birds outside the nursery window and the names of the wild flowers along the eastern fence and the particular way that you fold a pie crust at the edge so that it holds. Josephine had never called Nora mother. She called her Nora as was customary. But there was a quality in the way she said the name, a weight, an ease, an absence of distance that several people noticed over the years without knowing what to do with the noticing. It was in 1853 that Josephine, now 6 years old, first saw Pearl. Pearl was by then living in the quarters in a small house that Hattie and Lou managed together. Two older women with no children of their own, who had raised Pearl from infancy, with the particular thoroughness of people performing a task that matters more than they are allowed to say. Pearl was small for her age, but dense with energy, quick and sharp-eyed, with a stillness that dropped over her when she was thinking that made her look for a moment much older than she was. Josephine had gone out to the quarters to find Nora on an afternoon when Nora had stayed longer than usual. She had slipped out from the main house without telling anyone, which she did occasionally with the quiet effectiveness of a child who was learned which floorboards don't creak. She found Nora in the doorway of Hattie's house, holding Pearl, who had cut her hand on a piece of fence wire. Nora was wrapping the hand in a strip of cloth, and Pearl was very still, watching Nora's face rather than her own hand. the way that children watch the person they trust when something hurts. Josephine stopped at the edge of the yard. She looked at Pearl for a long time. Then she looked at Nora. Nora saw her. Something moved across Nora's face. Something that passed quickly, but not before Josephine caught it. Josephine was 6 years old and had been watching Nora's face for all of her 6 years, and she caught it the way you catch a sound that was not supposed to carry. "Who is she?" Josephine asked. "Her name is Pearl," Nora said. "She got hurt. I'm fixing it." "Does she belong to this place?" "Yes." Josephine looked at Pearl again. Pearl looked back at her with the direct, unsentimental gaze of a child who has learned early that the world requires looking at straight. "She looks like you," Josephine said. Nora did not answer. That evening, Josephine told Henry about Pearl. Henry asked questions. How old was she? Where did she live? Who were her parents? Josephine said she didn't know. Henry said they should find out. Josephine said nothing. She was 6 years old, but she had already, in some way she could not name, begun to understand that there were things at Grayfield that answered to a different set of rules than the ones she'd been told. The 1850s moved forward with the slow gravity that decade had in the American South. A decade of extraordinary material prosperity for men like Edmund Hale, built on a system that was in the larger world increasingly contested. Edmund was aware of the political situation. He read the newspapers. He attended the political meetings in Natchez, where men who owned the land and the labor that worked it debated with considerable heat what was owed to them and what forces intended to take it away. He was not a man of strong political passion, but he understood threat assessment, and by the mid-1850s, he had assessed that the threat was real. He made a series of practical arrangements. He moved more of his capital into land rather than notes. He kept his labor force stable and did not add significantly to it. He maintained Grayfield's cotton operation as a closed, self-sufficient system as much as possible, reducing his dependency on the supply chains that passed through the more politically volatile markets of New Orleans. He also, in 1855, sent Henry away to school. The school was in Nashville, a respectable institution that produced graduates who entered law, medicine, or plantation management. Edmund told Henry that a planter's son needed education, and that Nashville offered what Mississippi could not yet. Henry was 8 years old. He did not protest openly. He had learned, as children of composed and cold men sometimes do, that protest was a form of energy best invested elsewhere. The night before Henry left, he came to find Nora in the kitchen. She was banking the fire for the night, the kind of low automatic task that the hands do while the mind is somewhere else entirely. Henry sat on the stool by the back door and watched her. He was 8 years old, already tall for his age, with a serious face that got more serious when he was feeling something he didn't know how to say. "Will you remember what I look like?" he asked her. Nora sat down the iron poker and turned around. "I'll remember," she said. "You sure?" "I have not forgotten a single face in my life," she said. "Not one." Henry nodded. He seemed to want to say something else, but didn't, and after a moment, he got up and went back inside. Nora stood in the kitchen for a long time after that. With Henry gone, the dynamic of the main house at Grayfield shifted. Edmund was more present, which did not make the house feel less lonely. It made it feel a different kind of lonely. The way a large room with one person in it is lonelier than an empty room, because the emptiness has been named. Josephine grew through those years of her father's hovering proximity into a young woman who was, by the near universal account of everyone around her, difficult to read. She was not cold. She was not unkind. She was not the kind of girl who caused trouble through temper or carelessness. She was something more peculiar. She was exceptionally composed for someone who was clearly feeling a great deal, and she had the quality rare in a girl of 12, 13, 14, of listening to a conversation with her full attention, while also visibly processing something that had nothing to do with what was being said. Her father found her difficult in this particular way. He was a man who managed people by reading them, and Josephine was difficult to read. He preferred Henry in the way that men who prefer simplicity prefer the child who is more legible. Josephine spent those years in close and constant proximity to Nora, not in a way that anyone could have pointed to as improper or unusual. Nora was her attendant, her teacher of domestic arts, her presence in every room where domestic things were happening. The relationship was in form exactly what it was supposed to be. The enslaved woman caring for the master's daughter. The form was correct, but under the form, something else had been growing for years, and by the time Josephine was 13 or 14, it had grown to a size that was hard to contain in the form any longer. Josephine asked questions, not loudly, not in front of Edmund. In the evening, in the kitchen, in the upper hallway, when the rest of the house had settled, and the two of them were doing the small maintenance tasks that kept a house running, mending, folding, checking the wicks of the lamps. She asked about the Virginia plantation where Nora had come from. She asked about the people there. She asked what Nora's mother had been like, whether she remembered her. She asked about Pearl slowly over months, never all at once, adding a question here and a question here and a question there in the patient lateral manner of someone doing a puzzle without the picture on the box. Nora answered carefully. She was always careful. She had been careful for so long that carefulness had become the default setting of everything she did. Not fearfulness, but precision. The precision of someone who has spent years measuring exactly how much truth is safe to speak. She told Josephine about Virginia. She described the flat land and the smell of tobacco and the blue gay mornings of the eastern fall. She spoke about her mother with a gravity that Josephine understood, even then meant more than words. She said that her mother had been a woman who noticed things, that she had a memory for faces and names and the exact sequence of events, that she had passed this quality on to whom she did not say. Josephine held this. In the summer of 1858, when Josephine was 11 and Pearl was 10, though they did not know they were almost exactly the same age, because Pearl's birth had not been entered in any record accessible to the children of the main house. Josephine came to the quarters again. She came deliberately this time. She had waited for an afternoon when Edmund was in Natchez, which he visited every 2 weeks for business. She told the housekeeper she was going to walk the eastern fence line, which she sometimes did, and she walked instead to the quarters. Pearl was sitting in the yard of Hattie's house, sorting dried beans into a bowl. She looked up when Josephine came around the corner, and she did not startle. She simply looked in the way she always looked, with the direct, unafraid eyes that had struck Josephine the first time she saw them. Josephine sat down in the yard without being invited. "I'm Josephine," she said. "I know who you are," Pearl said. "What do you know about me? I know you live in the main house. I know your name. I know Nora takes care of you." Josephine looked at her. "Nora takes care of you too." Pearl set the bowl of beans down slowly. "She's not supposed to tell anyone that. She didn't tell me. I figured it out." Pearl looked at her for a long time. Then she picked up the beans again and went on sorting. "What else did you figure out?" Pearl asked. Josephine did not answer immediately. She watched Pearl's hands, small and deft and quick, moving through the beans, pulling the soft ones out and setting them aside. "I don't know yet," Josephine said finally. "That's why I came. If you're already feeling that this story is pulling you, somewhere you can't quite see yet. You're right. What we're about to reach is the part that took 20 years to surface. Stay with us. Henry Hale came back from Nashville in 1859, 18 years old, educated in the ways that Southern schools in that period educated their students in law, in the management of agricultural enterprise, and in the political philosophies of a region that felt increasingly under siege from the outside. He was not, however, what the school had expected to produce. He had come home different in a way that Edmund noticed immediately and regarded with the focused, controlled concern of a man who sees a variable that he had not planned for. Henry asked questions he had not asked before, or had asked more gently. He asked about the management of the labor force with a specificity that was unusual. Not in the plantation management sense, not asking about efficiency and production, but asking about individuals, names, histories, where people had come from. Edmund told him to talk to the overseer, a man named Doss, who kept the labor records. Henry talked to Doss, and then he talked to Ruth, who was by then the oldest person on Grayfield, and had been there since before Edmund purchased the property. And then, quietly, he talked to Nora. What passed between Henry and Nora in those conversations of the fall and winter of 1859 is not directly recorded. There are fragments in Henry's later correspondence in the testimony collected in 1866 in a journal that Henry began keeping that year, whose pages survived in incomplete form. The fragments suggest a series of conversations that moved slowly over weeks from the general to the specific, and that arrived finally somewhere that neither of them had announced as the destination, but that both of them perhaps had understood was where they were going. Henry was 18. He had grown up at some removed from Grayfield at a school in Tennessee, where the conversations he was exposed to were broader in range than those available in Adams County, Mississippi. He had heard things. He had read things. He had, in the particular way of young people who are good at thinking, and have been given time to think, arrived at a set of questions about his own life that he did not yet know how to address directly. The question he could not stop returning to was, why did Nora look at him the way she did? It was not a sentiment he could name precisely. It was not accusation. It was not resentment. It was not even the tenderness of genuine maternal feeling expressed freely, which he had seen in the way some mothers looked at their children. It was something more pressed, more compressed, like a feeling that had been folded in on itself so many times that it had become very small and very dense, and what you saw of it was only the shape of something whose size you couldn't measure. He began to pay attention to details he had spent his childhood not paying attention to, in the way that children of comfortable houses do not pay attention to the furniture. It is simply there, part of the given reality of the place. He paid attention to Pearl. Pearl was 11 that fall, living in the quarters, sharp and self-contained. Henry had known she existed. He had known all the people on Grayfield by name, because he was the kind of person who learned names. But he had not looked at her closely until that fall. When he looked at her closely, he felt something shift in his chest that he could not explain. He wrote about it in his journal in a single oblique sentence that has been preserved. There is a girl in the quarters named Pearl, whose face I find I cannot stop thinking about. Not from any sentiment of that kind, but from the feeling that I am looking at something I have seen before in a different place. He did not write what came next, or if he did, those pages are gone. By 1860, the political situation in Mississippi was consuming the attention of every man with anything to lose, and Edmund Hale's attention was as consumed as anyone's. The presidential election of November 1860 produced the result that the South's more extreme voices had been predicting and half-engineering for years. By December, South Carolina had declared itself out of the Union. By January 1861, Mississippi followed. Edmund Hale attended the state convention. He was not a delegate, but he was present in Jackson when the Ordinance of Secession was signed among the crowd of planters and merchants and lawyers who had gathered to witness what they understood as either the beginning of a righteous struggle or the beginning of a catastrophic mistake, depending on which corner of the room they stood in. Edmund was in the corner that understood it as a catastrophic mistake, not on moral grounds, but on practical ones. He wrote a letter to his brother in Charleston that January, which survives, in which he said, "I have never believed that what is right is always what is wise. But in this instance, I find that neither condition has been satisfied. We are walking into a fire because certain men have convinced us the fire will not burn us." He went nonetheless. He sent Henry, who went in the second year of the war as a commissioned officer in the Confederate infantry, because there was no other option that did not carry consequences worse than going. And at Grayfield, the household contracted around the remaining people, Edmund, Josephine, Nora, and the reduced domestic staff that remained when many of the male workers were pressed into labor battalions by the Confederate military. It was during the war years that the relationship between Josephine and Pearl ceased to be the careful, negotiated thing it had been throughout their childhood, and became something more direct. Josephine was 14, 15, 16. Pearl was the same age, almost to the week. They had grown up 200 wide apart, one in the main house and one in the quarters. And the invisible wall between those 200 yards, the wall made not of wood or brick, but of everything the plantation system was built on, had been the primary organizing fact of their existence. The war changed the architecture of daily life at Grayfield in ways that the abstract political categories of the conflict could not fully capture. With Edmund spending more time in Natchez on business and correspondence, with the overseer gone to the war, with the daily operations of the property shifting under the weight of changed circumstances, the strict maintenance of every boundary became harder to sustain with its previous rigor. Pearl began to come into the kitchen of the main house, not because she was invited, because she came. And Nora, who was the person there to see her come, did not send her away. It is important here to pause and consider Nora, not as she appears in the records, as a name in an auction listing, a presence in other people's accounts, a figure whose significance is measured by what was done to her and what she carried as a result, but as a person who spent 19 years navigating a reality that required from her a quality of endurance that most people never have to discover whether they possess. She had come to Grayfield at 22. She was now in her early 40s, and she had spent every one of those years inside the specific and terrible knowledge of what had happened to her, and of what she was doing every day in the nursery, and then in the hallways, and then at the kitchen table, and of what it meant, and of what she could not say. She had raised 2 children she could not name as hers. One of them she had been with every day. She had watched Josephine become the person Josephine had become. The sharp-eyed, quiet girl who noticed everything, who asked questions, who had sat in the yard of Hattie's house with Pearl and sorted beans, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if the whole vast structure of Grayfield's hierarchy were something she could simply choose to sit outside of for an afternoon. And Nora had watched Pearl grow in the quarters. Watched her from that terrible middle distance, the close far away that is worse than absence because it contains everything. Absence contains, plus the added weight of presence, of nearness, of being able to see and touch, and not be able to name why you are touching. She had made her choices inside an environment that did not acknowledge that she had choices. She had decided somewhere in those first long years that what she could give her children, both of them in their very different ways, was exactly what her mother had given her. The quality of attention, the ability to see clearly, the capacity to read the room. She had given them this not through speech, but through example, the way all the most durable things are transmitted. She had watched Henry grow into a young man who asked the right questions, and she had watched Josephine grow into a young woman who already suspected some of the answers. And she had watched Pearl grow into a girl with iron in her spine and clear eyes, and the particular quality of patience that is not passive, but accumulated, patience as a form of preparation. What she had not given any of them, because she could not, was the simple fact of herself, the sentence, "I am your mother." The declaration that would have reorganized everything they knew. She did not know if she would ever be able to give them that. She did not know what the world would look like by the time it was safe to say it, or if safe was even a category that applied. She waited. In the spring of 1863, with the war entering its most brutal phase, and the Union Army advancing through the Mississippi River corridor, Edmund Hale made a decision that revealed something about the nature of the man that the ordinary business of peacetime had kept partially concealed. He decided to move, not to leave Mississippi permanently. He was not ready to believe the situation was that irreversible, but to move certain things, documents primarily, his ledgers, his land records, the deed papers, and the correspondence with his lawyers, and the financial instruments that represented what he had built over 20 years. He moved them from the main house to the overseer's cabin, which sat on the far edge of the property, away from the river road, less visible to any advancing military presence. He did this himself over 2 days in March, and he told no one on the property what he was doing or where things had been taken. He locked the overseer's cabin and kept the key. Pearl found the key in August. This requires some explanation. Edmund had developed in his middle age the habit of keeping his keys on a ring that he carried in his coat pocket. This was known to everyone at Grayfield, the way personal habits of people in authority become known to the people around them through constant proximity and the need to know. He kept the key ring in his right coat pocket. He had done this for years. In August of 1863, Edmund Hale was ill, not catastrophically. He was 50 years old and had been pushing himself hard through the stress of the war years, and his body had registered a protest in the form of a fever that confined him to his room for 9 days. During those 9 days, he was in his bed. His coat was on the chair. The coat was in the room which Nora entered twice a day to bring food, change linens, and manage the sick room. She did not take the key. She would not have taken the key. But on the 5th day of Edmund's illness, when she came to collect the breakfast tray, she found the key ring on the floor beside the chair, fallen. Probably when the coat had slid, she picked it up. She set it on the table, beside the bed within Edmund's reach. She did not look at the keys for longer than the moment of the action, but Pearl, who had been in the hallway when Nora came out of the room, had seen the keys in Nora's hands for the brief moment before they were replaced. And Pearl, who had the memory for faces and names and the precise sequence of events that she had inherited without knowing it, had noted the shape of the ring and the number of keys on it. And Pearl, who had grown up on the property and knew every building on it, including the overseer's cabin that had been shut and locked since March, had understood something. She waited 11 days. She was 16 years old. She had learned from whoever had raised her that patience was preparation. On a September afternoon, when Edmund had recovered and gone to Natchez for business, Pearl went to the overseer's cabin. The door was locked, but the window on the north side had a latch that had never worked properly, and Pearl had known this since she was 12, because she had once hidden in that cabin during a thunderstorm and had gotten in through that window. She got in through it now. She found the documents. She was not at 16 a highly sophisticated reader of legal and financial instruments, but she was literate. Nora had taught her in the same sideways, careful, invisible way that Nora had learned, passing knowledge in fragments and in quiet, and she could read well enough to understand that what she was holding was significant. She looked through the ledgers quickly because she did not have time to read everything, and because she was looking for something specific, though she could not have said exactly what. She looked through the deed papers. She looked through a stack of letters, brownaged and bound with a piece of twine that she untied carefully and retied when she was done. The letters were from Dr. Ambrose Vickers. There were 9 of them, spanning the years 1847 to 1853. Pearl read the first 3 before she understood what she was reading. She read all 9 before she put them down. She tied the twine back around them with the same careful knot it had been in before. She climbed out the north window. She walked back to the quarters. She went to Hattie's house and sat down on the step in the September afternoon light and did not speak for a long time. Hattie came to the door and saw her sitting there. "What happened?" Hattie asked. Pearl looked up at her. "I think," Pearl said slowly, "I need to talk to Nora. This is the moment. You can feel it." That particular September afternoon in 1863, in a small house at the edge of a Mississippi plantation, when a 16-year-old girl sat down with what she knew. "We'll be right back." The conversation between Pearl and Nora happened that evening. It happened in the small room adjacent to the kitchen. The room that had been Nora's for 20 years, the room so close to the main house that you could hear on quiet nights the particular creak of the floorboard at the top of the stairs. Pearl came to the room after dark, which was permitted because Pearl was known to visit Nora in the evenings, and this was one of the arrangements that existed at Grayfield without being formally acknowledged. Pearl sat on the stool. Nora sat on the edge of her cot. They were in lamplight, the room very small around them. Pearl told her what she had read. She told her about the letters, about the dates, about what Dr. Vickers had written. She did not have the letters with her. She had put them back exactly as she had found them, because she was 16 years old and was already thinking several moves ahead. But she had the memory of them, and she laid it out in the patient, orderly way she had of presenting things she had already fully organized in her mind. When Pearl finished speaking, Nora was very still. The lamp threw its light across the wall. Outside, somewhere in the quarters, a man was playing a low, repetitive figure on a banjo, barely audible, more felt than heard. "How long have you known?" Pearl asked. Nora was quiet for a moment. "I have known since the beginning," she said. Pearl looked at her. "Did they know? Henry and Josephine?" "No." "Does Josephine suspect something?" Nora considered this. "She suspects there is something to know." She said she has suspected that for years, but she does not know what the something is. Pearl was quiet for a moment. "Then what are we going to do?" "We are not going to do anything yet." Nora said, "We are going to be careful. The war changes things." Nora agreed. "But it doesn't change what is safe and what isn't." "Not yet." Pearl looked at her hands. "Those letters, if someone who knew what to do with them, read them." "Yes," Nora said. "So, we need to keep them where they are. Until we know more." Nora said. "Yes." Pearl looked up. She looked at Nora's face in the lamplight, the face she had been looking at for her entire life, the face she had always read more easily than most, understanding by now something about why. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Pearl asked. The question was simple and enormous. Nora held it for a moment before she answered. "Because telling you would have made you carry it," she said. "You were a child. I was not going to put that weight on a child. I'm not a child now." "No," Nora said. "You're not." Pearl was quiet. The banjo in the quarters had stopped. The night was very still. "I'm angry," Pearl said finally. Not loudly. "The way you say something true." "I know," Nora said at him.
"Yes."
"Not at you." Nora did not say anything. She reached across the small space between them and took Pearl's hand and held it. And that was the whole of what was possible in that moment, in that room, in that world. It was not enough. It had never been enough, but it was what there was. And Nora held it with the same careful, deliberate grip with which she had held everything that mattered and was not allowed to be held openly. Henry Hale came home from the war in the spring of 1865. He came home changed in the way that men come home from wars that lasted 4 years and ended in defeat, carrying something inside him that no name in ordinary conversation, that appeared in the set of his jaw, and the deliberateness of his movements, and the particular quality of his silences, which had always been thoughtful and were now something more than that. He was 24 years old. He had been at Shiloh. He had been at Vicksburg. He had been at the fall of Atlanta and the subsequent retreat through Georgia in the winter of 1864, and he had done all of this as a junior officer in an army that was by 1864 fighting a war it could not win against a clock that was running down. He arrived at Grayfield on a Thursday morning in April, 2 weeks after Appomattox. Edmund was on the gallery when Henry came up the road. They looked at each other across the distance between the road and the steps, and then Edmund walked down, and they stood together for a moment before going inside. Henry found Nora in the kitchen. She turned from the stove when she heard him come in, and she looked at him with the same expression he had been trying to describe to himself for 5 years, that compressed, pressurized look that contained too much for the surface it occupied. And he thought, not for the first time, that he needed to understand what that expression meant. "You're home," she said. "I'm home," he said. He sat down at the kitchen table, the way he had sat at it as a boy, because some things the body remembers regardless of what the years have done to the rest of you. "Is everyone here?" he asked. "Pearl is here," she said. "Hattie and Lou," he nodded. "And Josephine, and Josephine." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Nora, I have some things I need to ask you." Nora turned back to the stove. "All right," she said. "Not yet," he said. "When there's time. When there's room for it." "There will be time," she said. The emancipation had come formally to Mississippi with the end of the war. The legal structure that had organized Grayfield for 24 years dissolved in those weeks, and in its dissolution produced something that was not immediately freedom, because the systems and dependencies and arrangements of the plantation did not dissolve as rapidly as the legal text. But that was for the first time a situation with different possibilities than the one that had existed the day before. What the change produced at Grayfield in the immediate term was a kind of suspended uncertainty. Edmund Hale, who had built his entire life around the management of exactly this property and exactly this operation, found himself at 60 years old in a situation that no amount of calculated patience had prepared him for. He was not a man who showed fear, but he was for the first time in anyone's memory on the property a man who did not appear to know what move to make. Nora stayed. Pearl stayed. Josephine stayed. Henry stayed. This was not, for most of them, entirely a choice in the simple sense. The realities of 1865 in rural Mississippi offered limited, immediate options for people who had spent their lives on a single plantation and had nowhere obvious to go and no resources independent of the place. But the texture of the staying had changed, and everyone on the property felt this even without the vocabulary to describe it precisely. In the summer of 1865, a Freedmen's Bureau office opened in Natchez. The Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, was the federal agency created in the last months of the war to manage the transition of formerly enslaved people into legal freedom, to negotiate labor contracts, to adjudicate disputes, and to collect testimony. It was underfunded, understaffed, and operating in an environment of profound hostility from the white population of the South. But it was there, and it represented for the first time a federal apparatus with at least nominal interest in the interests of black Southerners. Pearl heard about the Bureau from a man named Dawson, who was traveling through Adams County that summer, visiting the plantations and explaining to the newly freed people what the Bureau was and what it could do. Pearl was 18. She was one of the people on the property who could read, a quality she had kept quiet for most of her life, because the world she had grown up in did not reward such qualities in the people it wanted to keep controllable. She went to Natchez in September. She did not tell Edmund, she told Nora. Nora said, "Be careful. Come back before dark." Pearl went with Hattie's son, a man named Deacon, who was 20 and had been freed from a neighboring plantation and was navigating the same strange new geography of formal freedom in an environment that had not yet decided whether to accept it. At the Bureau office, she met the agent named Patrick Corbin. She told him what she knew. She did not tell him everything. Not yet, not in that first meeting. She told him enough to establish that she had information that bore on the legal history of a specific property in Adams County, and that this information might be relevant to questions of inheritance and documentation that the Bureau was already beginning to encounter in the restructuring of land and labor arrangements in the region. Corbin was a man of about 35 from Vermont with the careful, deliberate manner of someone who had been trained as a lawyer before the war and had taken this posting because he believed the work mattered. He listened to Pearl with full attention. He asked her to come back. She came back 4 times over the next 6 months, each time with more detail, building toward the full account. Hattie and Lou gave their testimony in January 1866. Deacon helped arrange other interviews, and Henry, who had by this point had several of those conversations with Nora that they had both been approaching since his return, gave his own account in the spring of 1866. Henry's account is the most extraordinary document in the record. Not because it is the most detailed. Hattie and Lou are more specific, and Pearl is the most organized, but because of who is giving it, and what it cost him, and what it means. He sat in Patrick Corbin's office in Natchez on a Tuesday morning in April 1866, and he told the truth about what he had come to understand about his own life. He said, "I believe that the woman named Nora, who was enslaved at the Grayfield plantation owned by my father Edmund Hale, is my mother and Pearl's, and that Josephine's mother is the same." He said, "I believe that what was represented to the county and to Clara Hale, and to the two of us for all of our lives, was a fabrication, and that the documents in the overseer's cabin at Grayfield, which I have now examined with my own eyes, support this." Corbin wrote this down in his precise, careful hand. "How long have you known this?" he asked Henry. Henry was quiet for a moment. "I've suspected it," he said, "since I was 18. I think I've known it in the way of knowing things you can't say since I was a child." The summer of 1866 produced the confrontation that the preceding 20 years had been building toward slowly, incrementally in the way that things build when the pressure has nowhere to go, but continues to accumulate. Edmund Hale was summoned to the Natchez courthouse in June of 1866. The Freedmen's Bureau did not have criminal jurisdiction over the events in question. The legal landscape was complicated, and the specific nature of what Edmund Hale had done did not fit cleanly into any single legal category that the existing law of 1866 had yet articulated. But the Bureau had the capacity to compel testimony, to collect and register documents, and to create a formal record that would exist in the Federal Archive. Edmund came to the courthouse. He was 61 years old, thinner than he had been, with the controlled, opaque expression that had characterized him in every room of his life. He sat across a table from Patrick Corbin and two other Bureau officials, and he was shown the letters from Dr. Vickers. He read them without visible reaction. Corbin asked him to explain the contents. Edmund was quiet for a long moment, then he said, "Doctor, Vickers was not always precise in his language." Corbin set down the third letter, the one dated November 2nd, 1847, with the passage that left almost nothing to interpretation, and looked at Edmund. "Mr. Hale," he said, "I want to be direct with you about what we're doing here and why." Edmund looked at him. "The people named in these documents," Corbin said, "have given testimony. The record we are assembling is not a criminal proceeding, but it is a federal record, and it will stand. What we are asking you today is whether you wish to contribute to it, or whether you prefer to leave it as it is." Edmund said nothing for a moment. He looked at the letters on the table. He had kept those letters for 19 years in a locked cabin on his property. And it must have occurred to him in that moment, as it must have occurred to him when Pearl found the window, that keeping a thing is not the same as securing it, that a thing locked in a cabin is still a thing in the world, still a thing that can be reached. He said, "I would like to speak to a lawyer." He was entitled to do this, and he was allowed to do this, and the session concluded. Edmund Hale died in January of 1867, before any further legal action was taken. He died at Grayfield in the room where he had slept for 26 years with the controlled quietness that had characterized everything else about him. He left no confession. He left no letter of explanation to his children. He left a will that divided the property between Henry and Josephine in equal shares. He left nothing to Pearl. This omission would itself become part of the record. In the fall of 1866, after the courthouse and before Edmund's death, Nora gave her testimony to Patrick Corbin. She came to Natchez alone. She arrived at the Bureau office on a Tuesday morning in October, the same kind of morning it had been in October of 1847. The same quality of light over the river. The same particular smell of the Mississippi autumn, which is not a sad smell exactly, but is a heavy one, layered with the residue of seasons. She sat in the chair across from Corbin's desk, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she looked at him with the calm, measuring attention she had always had, and that 19 years of practice had made almost perfect. She spoke for 3 hours. She told him about Virginia and the tobacco plantation, and the auction in Natchez, and the first year at Grayfield. She told him about the winter of 1846 and the spring of 1847 with a precision that was painful and that she delivered without flinching because she had made a decision somewhere in the long years that when the time came to speak it, she would speak it fully. She told him about October 1847, about the delivery and the night that followed, about the morning when Henry was gone from the room. She told him about Pearl. She told him about the 19 years Corbin wrote everything down. He was a careful man, and he was a good one, and he had been in this chair for a year. hearing testimony from people who had experienced things that the ordinary moral vocabulary of his upbringing had not prepared him to receive. And he had learned over that year to receive it with the full weight of attention it deserved. When Nora finished, he asked her one question. "In all of those years," he said, "was there ever a moment when you considered leaving? Leaving the property, leaving Natchez?" Nora looked at him. "Where would I have gone?" she said. It was not a rhetorical question. She was asking him specifically to understand the geography of the situation, to understand that freedom without resources, without documentation in Mississippi in the 1850s, was a theoretical category with almost no practical content, particularly for a woman with a daughter who could not be acknowledged and 2 other children she would not abandon. Corbin wrote it down. He wrote it exactly as she said it. Where would I have gone? The day after Nora gave her testimony, Henry came to find her. He found her in the kitchen at Grayfield, in the same posture she had been in on so many mornings of his life, at the stove, her back to the door, her hands at work on whatever the morning required. He came in quietly, the way he had always come into the kitchen, because even as a grown man of 25, there was something in that room that still had the quality of sanctuary. He sat down at the table. She turned around. He had been trying for a year to find the right words for this moment, the right opening, the right way to step across the distance that the previous 25 years had built between who she was to him in form and who she was to him in fact. He had turned it over in his mind in the way that he turned over every difficult question, methodically from multiple angles, looking for the approach that lost the fewest things in the crossing. He could not find the right words. He said, "I know." Nora looked at him. "I know," he said again. "I've known for a while. I should have found a way to." He stopped. He started again. "I'm sorry that I was in that school, that I was away, that I didn't. You were a child." Nora said, "Not always. For a long time," she said. "For long enough." He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, or rather had never been allowed to see on him before, because he had always been careful, as she had been careful, to keep the most direct things behind the forms that the world required. The expression was something simple and enormous, the look of a person who has spent years holding something at arm's length and has finally put it down. "You raised us," he said. "Yes, you raised us knowing." Yes, he was quiet. "Every day," he said. "Every day," she confirmed. The kitchen was very still. Outside the window, the September light lay flat and gold on the cotton fields that were in that fall of 1866, beginning their last season under Edmund Hale's name. A season that would settle on the Bureau's records and the deeds and the complicated, unresolved question of what Grayfield was and what it owed. "What do you need?" Henry asked her. Nora considered the question. It was perhaps the first time in 23 years that anyone had asked her that directly in those words, and meant the full weight of them. "I need Pearl recognized," she said. "I need her share of this property in the record. I need it written down." Henry nodded. "It will be," he said. "I'll make sure of it." He meant it. He was in this, as in other things, his mother's son, the kind of person who said what he meant and understood that the meaning of a thing is established in the doing of it. Josephine had known something for a long time. She had known it in the way that people who are very good at paying attention know things that they have not yet been given the direct information to confirm through accumulation, through the thousand small details that do not fit the official account, and that over time refuse to be disregarded. She had known it since she was 6 years old in a yard in the quarters, watching Nora wrap Pearl's hand and feeling something shift in the architecture of what she thought she understood. She had known it through every conversation with Nora in the years after, through every question she had asked and every careful answer she had received. She had known it through Pearl, through the particular resonance of Pearl's face, Pearl's eyes, the specific quality of Pearl's presence that had always felt to Josephine less like meeting a stranger and more like recognizing something. She had never said it. She had waited in the same way everyone around her had waited for a situation in which it could be said. That situation arrived in the fall of 1866 in the form of a conversation with Henry that he came to her with after his own conversation with Nora. He sat down with her in the small sitting room off the gallery, the room with the window that looked east toward the creek, and he told her what he knew and how he knew it. Josephine listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know." Henry looked at her. "I've known for a while," she said. "I didn't know how to be sure. I didn't know how to." She paused. "I kept waiting for someone to say it." "No one was going to say it," Henry said. "Not while." "I know," she said. They sat together in the small sitting room for a while without speaking. Outside the window, the creek moved in the late afternoon light, brown and quiet, the way it had moved every afternoon of both their lives. "Pearl is our sister," Josephine said, not as a question. "Yes, she's known longer than we have." "Yes." Josephine nodded slowly. "She didn't come to us with it," she said. "She let us find our own way to it." Henry thought about this. "I think that was deliberate," he said. "Of course it was deliberate." Josephine said she's Nora's daughter. The formal recognition of Pearl claims on the Grayfield property was achieved after considerable difficulty and over the course of several years through a combination of the Freedmen's Bureau record, Henry's direct legal advocacy with his own lawyer in Natchez, and the evidentiary weight of the vicar's letters, which were entered into the Federal Archive in the fall of 1866 and became part of a body of documentation that outlasted everyone involved in creating it. It was not clean. It was not straightforward. The legal landscape of Reconstruction Mississippi was not a friendly environment for such claims, and the specific nature of the documentation, a collection of a dead doctor's letters, and the testimony of formerly enslaved women was not the kind of evidence that moved easily through the courts of that place and time. But the record existed. The record said what it said, and Henry, who had inherited his mother's quality of patient precision in the pursuit of a thing that mattered, did not stop. Patrick Corbin left Mississippi in 1868, when the Freedmen's Bureau began its long decline under the withdrawal of federal support. He returned to Vermont and resumed the practice of law. He carried his case files with him along with the personal letter he wrote to his brother that fall. The letter that was later found among his family's papers, the one that used the image of pressing your hand against a wall and finding it has no other side. He also carried the memory of Nora's face in his office on that October Tuesday in 1866, and the 3 hours of testimony she had given, and the final question he had asked, and the answer she had returned. He wrote about it in that letter. He wrote, "I have taken testimony from many people in this work, from many people in difficult circumstances, and I have learned to listen with a certain professional distance that protects one from being entirely undone. But this woman, this particular woman, put me to the full test of that protection. Not through drama, not through expressed anguish, through exactness. She told me exactly what had happened in the exact sequence, with the exact weight of each detail, and she did not deviate from the facts to make them more bearable or more terrible. She trusted me with the facts as they were." That is a form of courage I had not encountered before and have not encountered since. He kept the copy of her testimony in his files until his death in 1903. His daughter donated his papers to a Vermont Historical Society in 1908. They have been there since. Nora remained at Grayfield. She was 45 years old in 1866, and she had been at that property for 23 years. She stayed, not because she had no choice, because after the Bureau record and Henry's advocacy, she had more practical freedom than she had ever had, but because the place itself and the people in it constituted the whole of her world, as she had come to know it. She was not someone who threw things away when they became complicated. She was, in every way that mattered, the opposite of that. She and Pearl lived together at Grayfield for several years after the war in the quarters in the house that had been Hattie's. Hattie had died in 1864 quietly in that same house, and Lou had followed her 2 years later. The house was Pearl's in the way that things become yours through the care of them, which is not the legal way, but is in many respects the more permanent one. Josephine came to the quarters to visit. She came often in the first years with an awkward formality that gradually wore away over time into something easier. Not natural exactly, because the accumulated weight of 19 years of arrangement was not something that dissolved, but genuine in the way that things between people who are honestly trying to find each other across a distance can be genuine even before the distance is fuel. Lee closed. She and Pearl did not become easy with each other immediately, but they became real with each other, which is the more durable thing. Henry left Grayfield in 1868. He had decided, after much of the careful, extended deliberation that characterized all his significant decisions, that he was not going to be a planter. The system that had made Grayfield what it was, and him what he was, and Nora what she had been required to be for 20 years, was not something he was willing to reproduce in its next form. He went to St. Louis, where he studied law with the intention of doing what Corbin had done in Natchez, working the apparatus of legal documentation in the direction of the people the apparatus had historically worked against. Before he left, he came to the kitchen one last time. He sat at the table. Nora stood at the stove. He said, "I'll write." She said, "I know you will," he said. "Is there anything you need before I go?" She turned from the stove. She looked at him. This man who was 27 years old, and who had her eyes and her memory, and the lateral precise way she had of thinking, all of it worn in a different body than hers, but recognizable from any angle. "You're already doing it," she said. He understood her because he had inherited the quality of understanding. He left on a Thursday morning in September, the same kind of morning it had been when he was 8 years old and had sat in this kitchen and asked her if she would remember his face. She watched him go down the road from the kitchen window, and she did not look away until he was out of sight, and then she went back to the stove. The property changed in the years after Edmund's death. It was smaller, cultivated differently, with sharecropping arrangements that were a version of what had come before, wearing a different set of clothes. Not freedom exactly, but not the same thing as before, which is either a small mercy or a larger failure, depending on how you measure it. Nora was 50 years old in 1871. Pearl was 23. Josephine came to see them in the spring of that year, traveling from Natchez, where she had been living since her marriage in 1869, to a man named Charles Delaney, a quiet, serious man, a hardware merchant, who treated her with the careful respect she had always required in lie of requiring warmth, and who had been told, before the marriage, all of the relevant history, because Josephine was not a person who entered arrangements without full disclosure. She came on a Saturday in April when the air had the particular quality of Mississippi spring, humid and warm and green. everything growing with the slightly excessive enthusiasm of a place that has had a long winter and is not inclined to waste the sun. She found Nora and Pearl in the yard behind the quarters house doing the early garden work of that season. Turning the soil, setting the rows. They were working side by side, not talking, in the companionable quiet of people who have spent enough years together. That silence between them is just another form of speech. Josephine came around the side of the house and stopped at the edge of the yard. She looked at them for a moment before they saw her. She looked at the two of them working in the April light, and she saw in the set of the shoulders, in the angle of the heads, in the particular quality of the quiet between them, something she had spent her whole life watching from the wrong angle, and was now finally watching from the right one. Nora looked up. She saw Josephine. She looked at her daughter in the way she had always looked at her, with the compressed, pressurized feeling that had been there since the beginning and had never fully been able to name itself in any room that the world would have permitted. And then, in that yard in the April light in 1871, with no one watching but Pearl, she allowed it to look like what it was. Josephine walked across the yard. She set down the things she was carrying. She stood in front of Nora, and she looked at her. This woman who had bathed her and fed her, and taught her the names of the birds, and the wild flowers, and the way to fold a pie crust at the edge, and who had done all of this, while carrying every single day the weight of a truth that the world had not been willing to make room for. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I know who you are to me." Nora was very still. "I know who you are to me," Josephine said again, "and I am sorry it took this long for us to be able to say it." Pearl had stopped working. She was standing a few feet away, her hands at her sides, watching with the quiet attention she had always had. Nora looked at Josephine. Then she looked at Pearl. Then she looked at the April yard, the turned soil, the thin green lines of early growth just beginning to show in the rows. She thought about what it had cost to get here. She thought about what it meant to be here. She thought about 23 years in a house where everyone knew the truth, but no one was allowed to say it. She thought about all the years of that particular silence and how long a thing can be held before it becomes a different kind of thing entirely. And then she looked at the two young women standing in the yard with her in the April light in the spring of 1871, and she allowed herself to know in the full, uncondensed sense of the word that she had been their mother every day of their lives, that she had never for a single morning stopped being their mother, and that whatever the world had built to contain and deny that fact, the fact itself had been stronger. It had always been stronger. It had been waiting patient and solid for exactly this. The documentary record of the Grayfield case exists in the Freedmen's Bureau records, held at the National Archives in Washington. The testimony of Pearl, Hattie, and Lou, and the personal account of Henry Hale were collected in Adams County, Mississippi between 1866 and 1867 during a period when the Bureau was assembling evidence across the South for claims related to property, family recognition, and the legal legacy of the institution. Patrick Corbin's personal papers, donated to a Vermont Historical Society in 1908, contain his private account of the interviews conducted during his tenure. The letters of Dr. Ambrose Vickers, entered into the Federal Archive in the fall of 1866, became part of a body of evidence that was never fully resolved in the courts of that period and time. What was resolved was simpler and lasted longer. 3 people in a yard in Mississippi in the spring of 1871, with the truth finally allowed to be what it had always been. Some things cannot be sealed in a locked cabin. Some things find the window. If this story made you feel the weight of something real, something that happened in one form or another in hundreds of places across this country during these years, then you understand exactly why these stories need to be told. Leave a comment below and tell us at what moment did you first understand where this was going. Subscribe to the channel, because next week we go somewhere just as dark and just as true. The past is never finished, and neither are we.